Game over, man. Game over.
Johnny.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
So serious.
Roll out.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for July 13th, 2023, and I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
All right, Brendan, your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to somehow separate this film from today's events. Good
I
luck
don't
with
choose
that.
to accept that. It's called Mission Impossible for a reason, isn't it?
Yeah, for some context, as I noted, we are recording this on July 13th. Now, we are recording this before I move on to vacation. By the time this goes out, I will probably be on vacation. I don't know exactly when this is happening, but we recorded the next main show tonight as well. And if you remember July 13th, again, maybe it was just yesterday or it was a few days ago. I don't know. But it was a historical day for Hollywood. Oh, boy.
Remember. The
It was
13th
a
of July.
big day. And everyone was freaking out as SAG decided to go on strike along with the WGA. And a big part of that turned out to be artificial intelligence.
Wow, if we were to just call Hollywood the entity, that just kind of rolls off the tongue, doesn't it?
Yeah, you know, because it's one thing. We're gonna have some thoughts on this movie, on Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning, and it might not be incessant praise like we've seen with some critics. However, there is something to be said about the prescient timing of this movie with July 13th, 2023 that might make it better than what it was a few days ago for me.
I know. I mean, because technically this movie opened 2 days ago as we're recording this. I mean, its actual release was Wednesday the 12th, which was yesterday. But I mean, all these big movies come out a day early nowadays, right? It's like their new unofficial midnight screening that happens maybe as early as 2 p.m. the day before. But I mean, it's very well timed to this news that we're talking about, especially with regard to how AI is feeding into the discourse. It's almost turned Dead Reckoning Part 1 into a bit of a documentary.
Yeah. Weirdly, sadly, nightmarishly. That's just kind of how it's turned out to be.
Yeah.
But that's where we stand right now with Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning. Should we get into it? Are you ready, Brendan?
Yeah, let's talk about this thing.
Okay, so this is directed by Christopher McQuarrie. It stars Tom Cruise, Haley Atwell, Ving Rhames, Simon Pegg, Rebecca Ferguson, Vanessa Kirby, and many more that come and go throughout this film. So off the heels of Mission Impossible Fallout. So last week on the main show, so episode, what was that, 542?
That was 542, yes.
542? So we did a Mission Impossible retrospective, and as part of that conversation, we talked about how I really loved Fallout. It's one of my very favorite movies in this franchise. You liked it as well. You had some questions about the ending, though, and I'm going to be real curious to hear how you feel about this film given those thoughts. And where Dead Reckoning comes into play here. So let's go ahead. Let's get right into it. Let's also state up front that Brendan and I, we do love this franchise on the whole. We don't always agree with the films and our ranking, but on the whole, we are both big fans of this franchise.
Absolutely.
So, what did you think of Dead Reckoning Part Uno?
Should we make a few, I guess, stipulations up front, JD?
Sure.
A couple of them being, we recognize that this is a part one, okay? And we acknowledge that there is more to this story. Like, we've seen, 3 part ones this year alone, between Across the Spider-Verse, Fast 10, Fast X, or whatever the hell it's called, and now this. This one I think functions fairly well as a part one. It definitely does feel like a bit of a cliffhanger ending with certainly more dramatic resolution than Fast X did, right? It doesn't just cut to black like that film does.
Yeah.
Comedically so with that one. So we recognize that there is still another half to this story that could recontextualize a few things that we saw here, right? So it's kind of one of those things that anything we say about this movie, whether it be good or bad, does come with this sort of incomplete mentality.
Yeah.
So I want to get that out of the way first. And the other thing, too, is that given where this movie goes and some of the choices it makes, I think in order to best articulate our feelings of the film, it may require some spoilers. At least for me, there are specific things that this movie does that I will need to potentially get into.
Okay.
I think at the very least, let's lay our cards on the table first. We'll talk broadly. We'll talk about how we feel about the film on the whole. I love this franchise. I don't think there has been a bad film in this franchise. And walking out of Dead Reckoning Part 1, I said to myself, that's my least favorite Mission Impossible film, which means it's still pretty good. But as I thought about it more, this is the one that really started to collapse on itself for me. And at the moment, it is the first Mission Impossible film I am coming very close to saying, I didn't really like that one. And a lot of it really does come down to, I mean, we'll talk about some of its storytelling choices when we get to that particular part of the conversation.
Sure.
But this is the first one that didn't really feel like a step above what the others were doing to really try and push the Mission Impossible envelope, right? And maybe part of that comes with unfortunate circumstance. There were some COVID-related shutdowns as this movie was in production, and maybe that did trickle into the final product a little bit. I don't know, but there's a visual flair and aesthetic to this one that I found very troubling when compared to something like Fallout or even Rogue Nation more recently. I don't think it's one of the best looking or performed from an action spectacle standpoint Mission Impossible films. I don't think it quite reaches that. It's the first time I've seen a Mission Impossible film where the action scenes just didn't really impress me.
Okay.
And I think a lot of it is really due to the because all these movies rely at least a little bit on green screen and CGI to touch up what it needs to, right? But this is the first time I felt like it was overly reliant on it. And maybe it just had to do with Fraser Taggart cinematography and, not being able to meld well enough with it, that the final product came off as kind of artificial. Or maybe that's secretly the point. Maybe the look of this movie and how it looks less grand and practical is part of the theme, that this is a movie about the villainy of artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
That might be a bit of a reach. I don't know. But needless to say, this is the first one that felt like it didn't push the envelope as much as I think it maybe wanted to. That said, I think the story does have a timely manner to it that we'll certainly talk about. And it does treat this quote-unquote entity with a very fair and correct level of fear. Like, the entity itself is a pretty scary thing, the way it's treated in this movie. And I do think that's well handled, too. There are certain other storytelling beats that we'll certainly talk about that I don't think land very well. And I say that with the word think being emphasized because I don't know what's going to happen in part 2. But this is the most troubling and frustrating Mission Impossible film for me. And some of those frustrations are what's really holding it back for me. It's all I can keep thinking about. But there's a lot more we could talk about for sure. But I think this one kind of misses the mark more so than a lot of the others.
Okay, yeah, it's an interesting film to talk about, and I do want to reiterate some of those caveats that you open your thoughts with, because I am still very much processing this film. It's really hard to say if I'm mixed on it or if I like it or really like it even. Honestly, I don't really know. My thoughts at this point are incomplete. Okay. And some of that comes down to what you're saying in that this is a part 1 and part 2 might recontextualize a lot of what we see here in part 1. I also feel like I really need to see this movie again. And
I kind of think that too.
I think that will also help quite a bit. Perhaps this conversation will help solidify my thoughts a little bit. I did like it. I can say that right now. I walked out and I was more positive than I was mixed on it. But
okay,
as I'm noting, I'm not sure to which degree I like it. I can say confidently I loved its tone. There's a sense of dread that is potently dire in this movie. Really, for the first time, it felt as if no character outside of Ethan was safe. And this film goes out of its way to heighten those foreboding qualities. I think Tom Cruise is really great here. This is easily his best performance since Mission Impossible 3. So much of what he does here is internalized and contemplative, and his sense of urgency couples extremely well with those shuddering tones. The stunt work I did really like. I think it's quite great here. Visuals aside, I think the stunts themselves are excellent as always. I love the addition of Haley Atwell. I don't always love the writing around her character. There are
we'll talk about
that she makes that are callous, and there's very little context to make sense of them. But on the whole, I do love how she's clever and a little rough around the edges, and Atwell's committed performance gives the character an affable charm despite Grace's ambiguities.
Yeah.
But the writing is the element that I am grappling with, whether it be character choices, not just Grace, but Ethan as well. The use of artificial intelligence, we'll certainly get into all of that here. I am grappling with the film and what it really wants to be. In a vacuum and with its ideas, I think at times it's a little thin, perhaps a little bit uneven. And in the context of Mission Impossible as a franchise, it stumbles, I think, quite heavily on its own toes as well. So perhaps we can talk about that as we go here as well. But before we get to that, I'll quickly just reiterate that visually speaking, I am with you. I don't think it's the greatest. I don't know if it's because of any sort of switch to digital and how that juxtaposes what we've seen before. I don't know if that was intentional because of its themes on AI, or maybe they just wanted to make that leap for whatever reason. I don't always love it visually. The action, I think, is mostly good. I like the airport sequence. I think that's a lot of fun. And
that's probably the best one. And it's because it's not relying on the spectacle as much as it is
there's no spectacle. It's kind of more
it's
spy thrilling.
Yeah, it's more reliant on the sense of place, right?
Yes.
Whereas like that final train chase that is in some of the trailers, and I sort of jokingly referred to this as something that may have been a bit cruel and hyperbolic in our off text chain that we have with the with all of us in Session Film. I compared it to a Pixar film because it does kind of have an animated quality, and it's unfortunate because this is the first Mission Impossible film that is really doing its damnedest to call back to Brian De Palma's film.
Yeah, I mean, there are a ton of Dutch angles in this film.
Not even just that, the narrative beats are very similar. Not even just bringing back Kittredge once again, which the trailers have shown us, and he's back once again, and it's really exciting to see him, but like the fact that it ends with a train chase is very mirroring of that. Yeah. But this train chase, like it feels like it's surrounded by green screen to me. And I don't know if it even was. Like we've seen cases where movies are filmed, action movies specifically, are filmed in a very practical and lived in way, but they have this like digital sheen to it that makes it almost tricks us into thinking that it's fake. And sometimes that becomes a problem, and that might be what's happening here. There's a crispness to everything that it almost makes me feel like nothing was real. Like it was almost like this virtual reality of a Mission Impossible film. And like I said, maybe that was the point, but it's kind of a weird point to make, to say like, oh, let's make this movie look worse so we can actually make its themes more apparent.
Yeah.
Like it's a weird. I feel like I'm reaching there if that's what its point was, but it is kind of troubling when you had the great work from Robert Elswith and Rob Hardy in the previous two films, and how lush and almost poetic those movies were from a visual standpoint. And I don't think this one has it at all. It's just
I
not quite
agree.
there.
I do think this one is lacking visually. I do think the choreography of the action is done well enough, even if the visual vigor isn't there. There's enough happening on screen when coupled with the film's sense of dread, what's at stake, the emotion that is driving these characters here. I think there's enough going on there that the choreography and the action itself still is compelling. Like, despite the visual, despite the visual coarseness of that train sequence we see near the end, and how the cars keep, we'll say, losing grips on each other, I'll say vaguely.
Yeah.
There's something about how it's staged, coupled with the performances and how the film had built itself up emotionally, that I was still invested in the moment, even if visually it doesn't have the same tangibility as what we saw with the previous films, or even previous stunts in this film, such as the jump on the cliff that, they marketed heavily. So on the whole, that was way less of an issue for me. My biggest issue with the action set pieces here is this complete switch of tone, at least in the train sequence and with the Rome sequence. The airport sequence still maintains that dire sensibility. However, the train sequence and the Rome sequence almost get goofy at times.
Oh, this is
a little slapsticky, and I kind of appreciate that these films want to have a little fun, and with someone like Simon Pegg, there's going to be some comedy to them, and Simon Pegg is very good here. I didn't necessarily mind his humor as much. However, the Rome sequence and some of the borderline slapstick humor with Haley Atwell and Tom Cruise, when you put that in the context of just how grave this film is in its tone, and it tries to set that foundation early on that these characters are in serious trouble, that this AI entity has a presence and it's willing to kill, and it's one step or thousands of steps ahead of these characters. And the film makes that palpably clear early on. That to undermine that with slapstick makes no sense to me in this film.
That's one of my biggest problems with the action sequences as well, is that it's the first time I felt like, if it's also calling back to Mission Impossible 1, it's kind of also calling back to Mission Impossible 2 in some ways. Like, there are comparisons there. Again,
I just don't think that humor works here.
Well, not for this story. I don't necessarily mind the idea of Christopher McQuarrie kind of getting a little silly with his Mission Impossible film next, because after Fallout, it's maybe a decent change in tone. But given the nature of this story, and especially how it mirrors Tom Cruise's own passion for saving movies, I mean, there's definitely a meta component here for sure. There is definitely a jarring nature to those tones, right? And I don't think that always works. And I will say, as much... go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, that's exactly what it is. To me, it's so jarring because every other... Like, outside of those action beats, the film carries this almost doleful, bleak tone that anything could happen at any time. Maybe Ethan himself isn't even safe. Now, we know that there's going to be a part 2, so Ethan is going to be a part of that. But I seriously felt that anyone outside of Ethan could be in trouble, that they were vulnerable. And the film makes that clear. You feel that to undermine that, and again, broadly speaking, I don't mind these films having fun and throwing in some humor. You expect that to some degree, But given how daunting that feels and how the film goes out of its way to make you feel that way, that to become the complete extreme and be a little like it's like there's a difference between throwing in humor and then going as far as to spin the car the way they do it, and it becomes like I'm watching a Chaplin film all of a sudden. That goes that just does not work here. Like you've gone too far.
Yeah.
You've crossed the line.
Yeah. And it's unfortunate too, because there is a real grave and serious nature to this entity, as it's called, especially given the current landscape of Hollywood that we've been seeing all over the news lately. We don't have to go into it now. That's going to be something we talk about in episode 543. We'll get into more details there, but it certainly adds a lot of unfortunate relevance to this movie. I will say the way that the entity is treated here, as fearful as it is, I mean, it's treated like a god in some ways, and it sounds silly to say it that way, but it's not too far off from the realm of possibility nowadays, to the point that someone would actually look upon this thing as its new religious figure. It's more or less what Gabriel, the villain here, it's more or less what his intentions kind of are. It's like he looks at this entity as his new Christ of sorts. And for the record, there's a lot of religious allegories here. I don't know if you picked up on them, with the fact that his name's Gabriel, the name Grace, the fact that this key almost looks like a cross. So there's certainly a lot of that happening here. I will say, I think at the same time, while I like the way it's treated here narratively, I do think it is a bit of a missed opportunity. And one of my biggest problems with the film is that it gets the entire danger of the entity out of the way in the first 10 minutes. Yeah. Because doing so, it made me really miss the idea that this could have been an opportunity for them to go full analog. And that's talked about here. We see people with typewriters, but the team, Ethan, Benji, and Luther, I feel like they don't really take advantage of that
at all. No, they talk about satellites at one point. That's it.
I know, but it's like, and again, maybe this is me criticizing the movie unfairly by saying something I would have liked to see as opposed to what it's doing, but if this movie is calling back to Brian De Palma's film from 1996, what if the movie just went full 90s with its technology, because that's all it could do to remain distant from this spreading entity? Yeah. And they talk about it in this movie, but I don't think they take advantage of it enough.
Well, I think that's why I have somewhat of a question about the film's use of artificial intelligence. I don't know if it's vacuous or if it's alarmingly effective, or maybe a little bit of both. I don't know. And after today, that only compounds this question all the more for me. Because it's godlike omniscience gives the film a palpable desperation, but it also feels a little hollow and derivative. Are its postmodern ideas thematically compelling? I don't know. On a first watch, it all seemed kind of broad and vapid, but maybe that's because we're only halfway through this story. It's very likely that part 2 will explore its notions on AI further, making this much better in hindsight. At this point, though, at least regarding its use of AI, I think the film thinks it's smarter than what it actually is. And maybe some of that also comes down to its inconsistencies. And I don't always like picking apart logic, because that's often not what's driving these movies. However, there is something about how it goes out of its way to create this godlike presence. And again, the tone of it is heavy in that regard. Yeah. And the film does bring up those notions of analog that you're talking about. The CIA has to go to analog. The U.S. government has to go analog. But the IMF, for whatever reason, figures, let's just keep using computers. Maybe it won't find us.
But it's like the three of them, Ethan, Luther, and Benji, before that airport scene, they have a full-on conversation about the dangers of this entity. So it's like the fact that they wouldn't go full analog in that moment, it just feels out of character for how smart that we've known these people to be, which is, again, I don't mind the movie being one of those cases where they have to learn that as it goes, as if the entity is trying to keep up with their tactics. which is why I really wish this film didn't have that giant exposition dump in the beginning of the movie.
Well,
I wish it would have saved that for maybe midway through for that realization to come more naturally. And I think it plays that card way too early.
And I think that's why I call it vacuous, because we've seen these characters and we know how smart and clever they are when they understand what they're working with, and they very much do with the airport sequence. They come to realize in a visceral, tangible way, given the scare that they just had, what they're up against. And yet when they get to Rome, they continue using computers, and to me it renders that chase sequence through the streets and the earpieces and everything. Like at one point they have to destroy their computers because they become infected when they knew that this was a possibility the entire time.
I know.
And so it feels a little vacuous to me. And I also don't know if its notions on AI, again, broadly speaking, yes, AI, bad. It can become our overlords. Like that's about as far as this film goes thematically. And so it feels just a little vapid to me. And I just think the film thinks that it's smarter than what it is, even if as an antagonist, it is effective. Yeah. I just don't think thematically it's all that compelling, which is, again, why I feel like its use of artificial intelligence, is it bad or is it good? Or maybe it's a little bit of both. Like I'm kind of in the middle.
Well, this is where I think part 2 might help crystallize certain things, and maybe part 2 will be a full-on analog movie. Maybe that's what it's building towards. Again, like I'm not saying that's what I want, but that's an example of how we're recognizing that part 2 could potentially fix issues that we have with part 1, right? Mm-hmm. And some of those other issues that I think it'll fix are maybe with regard to certain character arcs. There are certain character choices that happen.
Is this where we want to get to spoilers?
Let's get to spoilers now. There's a particular thing that happens at the midpoint that I know has been very divisive among people. Mm-hmm. And I don't even know if it's going to hold. You know, this is one of those movies or one of those franchises that could flip the script in some way. And I mentioned that there are a lot of Christ allegories here, right? So maybe part 2 will include a resurrection. Jesus himself.
Ethan dies and raises to the heavens.
Oh man, if we see that his mission will be choosing to leave heaven to come back to the IMF. So Ilsa Faust is killed in this one. And I can both defend and criticize this choice. I think it works in some way, at least in its attempt to sort of call back to Fallout, right? That Fallout was a movie about Ethan always putting everyone else above himself. That he was serving the greater good, okay? And her death is meant to, I guess, evoke what it feels like for him to finally fail that mission, right? Mm-hmm. The problem I have with it, though, I think it's hard to explain, I think, but the problem is I think it comes at a time that was inappropriate for where this movie was. I also think if you wanted to solidify her death and make it feel that tied to Fallout, we should have waited to introduce Haley Atwell as Grace. Because by the time that Ilsa's death occurs, to me it just felt like we're removing another girl so Ethan can protect another girl. And it kind of makes it feel like this movie is more about Ethan's desire to protect women specifically as opposed to the greater good.
Instead of specific women.
Well, and especially when you get that flashback from this almost nameless character that involves the villain Gabriel, and how that kind of, spearheaded this whole thing in some ways. Like, it's just kind of weird, if you ask me. Like, especially when a character like Ilsa Faust had such agency, and even though she does die at her own choice, it seems as if her death is meant to really be a reflection of Ethan's desire to protect women specifically, and how that then funnels into Grace. And I feel like it strips away of her agency and her choice a little bit. It's just weird. I think it's not the intent, but I think the way it was told in that sequence, I think kind of collapses on itself. That did not work for me.
It does feel as if this franchise has no idea what to do with its lead female characters. And, because I talked about this heavily on episode 542 when we did our Mission Impossible retrospective. And I feel like we're at the same crossroads we were with Rogue Nation, because when I talked about Rogue Nation, I talked heavily about how I loved the inclusion of Julia in Mission Impossible 3. It was the right time for us to dig into Ethan as a character outside of the IMF, and Julia is a great character. And then she disappears for a movie. Although in Ghost Protocol, they do speak to it briefly, and I do appreciate that they do acknowledge it. And then you get to Rogue Nation, where Ilsa is introduced, and people fall in love with Ilsa. And my issue with that in that film, again, comes back to, well, what are we doing here with Ethan? What is the progression of this character? Are we going to care about him outside of the IMF? Are we going to care about him as a human, or are we not? Is it just going to be him and Ilsa now moving forward? And it felt like there were ambiguities in that film that weren't really answered until you got to Fallout. But we were at a crossroads with Rogue Nation, and here we are with Dead Reckoning Part 1, and I feel like we're at the same crossroads, but with two different women now, where, we get Ilsa in Rogue Nation, and she's great, and she's a big part of Fallout, although really Ethan's motives become more about Julia than they do Ilsa. And then we get the ending of Fallout, and now here we are with Dead Reckoning Part 1, and it's like, well, what is Ilsa to Ethan? Because most of this movie is about Ethan and Grace. Ilsa is very much in the backdrop. She is hardly a character in this movie. She's in one of the opening action set pieces. She disappears for a long time. She comes back. There's a very brief and weird, and in my opinion, completely unearned montage that elicits that maybe they're a little bit of a couple. And
I see it all over Twitter. Is it the first time in Venice moment that they have together? I see a lot of people on Twitter posting that scene as a very touching moment, and I thought it kind of I thought it kind of sucked.
Way out of place. Yeah,
that actually answered my problem with Fallout, because Fallout, I was kind of thinking, is this meant to suggest that they have like almost like the sexual tension between them, like a romantic kindling, as opposed to because I love the idea that there could be a love and a respect between them that doesn't need to be romantic, right? I would have loved to see it preserve that, and I think this specific scene completely disregards that.
It does.
I think it's I think it suggests that there was, like, if they weren't part of this IMF, they would get married. Is basically the vibe I was getting from it, and I don't think that's the right relationship for them. I never sensed that, and
I don't disagree with that. But it's even more bizarre from my perspective, because at the end of Fallout, I didn't sense any romantic tension between them like you did. To me, because of the grief they were experiencing, it just felt like a tender moment between friends who were consoling each other and were experiencing that grief together. That's what it felt like to me. So the romance in this feels all the more contrived because that was the first and only time it's ever brought up.
I will give Dead Reckoning Part 1 credit, though, and this is accidental credit. It's not. I don't think this was its intent, because I mentioned during our Mission Impossible retrospective that maybe Dead Reckoning will do something to get me to come on board to whatever Fallout was doing with that relationship at the end. Because in the middle of Fallout, when I saw it for the first time, when we got to that ending, I felt there's this awkward embrace between them, as if it's trying to suggest that it's romantic, but I'm not really sure. But I feel like it is. And the way that Dead Reckoning very directly gets into that, it makes me realize and look back at Fallout and think, Oh no, there wasn't. There wasn't anything romantic there, but now there is, and now it frustrates me.
Yeah,
It's-
I don't understand that at all. To me, that feels extremely forced. I understand people want that because they love these two characters, and individually, I understand it. Ethan is great. Isla is fantastic, and you got two beautiful people, and you want to see them be together. I get that, but these films. Even though Rogue Nation, I do think teases it, which is somewhat part of my problem, but Fallout does not. Fallout absolutely, in my opinion, I don't even think it's all that ambiguous given Ethan's response to Julia once she's brought into the fold. It is all about her.
Yeah.
And where he where he kind of sits in all of that, I think it's very straightforward.
Yeah.
And so to me, the film never really commits to them being in a relationship until you get to Dead Reckoning, when all of a sudden they're now, I guess, together because they're in Venice and they want to spend this moment to, like, where did that come from?
That
I
just
don't know.
feels like a course correct of sorts, because one of the things that bothers me in most movies like this these days is that when you get two beautiful people opposite each other like this, it almost feels like you need to make them romantically interested. And I'm I sometimes get kind of sick of that trope. Like, it's very rare to see a movie like this embrace the fact that maybe they just love each other in a non-romantic way. You know, and I kind of miss movies that would do something a little bit more like that. And I felt like we were getting that a little bit with Ilsa and Ethan for much of this franchise until this movie.
Yeah.
And that's really unfortunate for me.
Yeah, and I just don't know what the plan is with Ethan. I know we're getting to the end of this franchise, but I just find it maybe a little funny that we get to Julia, we disregard her for Ilsa, and now 2 films later, we're completely disregarding Ilsa for a completely new character. And it's like, so is he going to fall in love with Grace now? Is that what we're kind of suggesting we're going forward? I don't know.
Did it feel a little bit weird though? Like the way that it tries to portray Ethan's desire to protect people that are not him, like protect everyone else, and disregard his own life for the greater good, right? But here it comes off as if like he is the protector of these specific characters, Ilsa, Grace, and this nameless woman that shares a past with Gabriel that we see in flashback every now and then. It's and we even get a montage, not even a montage. It's like a brief like moment in the final act of the movie. Remember that?
Yes.
When he's offering to protect Grace in the falling of the train sequence, we get a very brief like flash of this nameless girl. We get one of Ilsa, and then we get one of Grace, as if to suggest I must protect these people.
Yes,
and it's just kind of weird. It's just really weird to me.
Well, and now you're getting into really what I consider to be the biggest question I have with this film, aside from the artificial intelligence angle that we've already discussed. But I have a lot of questions around character choices, particularly with Ethan. We just talked about Ethan and Isla, but there is the Grace character, a character that at every turn is trying to find a way to subvert Ethan, despite the fact that that without Ethan, she would likely have been captured several times over. He saves her life at least 3-4 different times. She's not a good driver, clearly not a fighter. The film makes it clear that she's clever. She's very smart and intuitive, but she's not a trained spy. And yet, every time she undermines Ethan in some way. And I get the film is trying to give Ethan some redemption based on those series of flashbacks you were talking about where, we see this, we see a little bit of his time before the IMF, but it's not enough to make sense of Ethan's incessant pursuit of her. What is it specifically about Grace that makes him feel a certain way toward her, especially when all she does is make you more vulnerable? And I'm talking about his emotional pursuit. I understand that Grace has one of the keys. So from a dramatic perspective, he is, of course, going after her. But that's not exclusively why he is drawn toward her. There's something else to it, and I don't think the screenplay makes that clear enough. Whatever Ethan's life was before the IMF, that is pivotal to all of this, but it's too ambiguous, and as a result, it makes his choices in this film a little baffling. But again, maybe part 2 will make sense of it.
Maybe part 2 will, especially when we see what happens with Grace, that she's now part of the IMF of sorts, which is an interesting arc for sure. But I mean, I don't know. I think the way it's portrayed here from the perspective of Ethan himself, it sort of makes it look like the film is treating Grace herself as more of an object than a character. Which is a shame, because I think for much of it, given Haley Atwell's really magnetic performance, she's great in the movie.
Yeah.
But the character of Grace, for much of it, has like this sense of autonomy, right? Mm-hmm. And I think by the time we get to the end, it almost inadvertently strips that away a bit. And I didn't really like that. That's why I say that if we wanted to try and actually give some credence to Ilsa's death, we should have waited to introduce Grace until later. Because it just feels like this sudden shift to write off another female character to let room for another one. And that's something I didn't really like.
Yeah, I have a big question around, and I do hope that part 2 is able to make sense of Ethan's choices here, because those flashbacks are certainly pivotal to this, whatever it is invoking. And we
I don't even know what it is. It almost feels like they were added in like a reshoot or something like that.
I don't really know. To me, it's too ambiguous to make sense of his choices as it stands. But again, I don't necessarily want to get too judgy with it when we haven't seen the whole story yet. And it's very possible that whatever we get next, we'll see more of those flashbacks, who this unnamed woman is and how that connects back to Grace in some way. I don't really know, but throughout this film, I kept wondering why Ethan is drawn to her, again, emotionally, not dramatically, why he is drawn to her despite the fact that she, steals the key from him at the airport. And then she slips away in this very clever, from Ethan's perspective, frustrating way from the police. And then, he saves her car, or saves her when driving that car around, and they're like tied together. And then she's still like handcuffs him to the wheel still, despite him saving her. Or at the club, like he saves her from these two guys, and yet she pushes Ethan into them and still runs. Like at every turn, she's trying to subvert him, despite Ethan, trying to save her desperately. Like those two things clash, and the writing to me and all of that is very thin as far as motive goes.
But I at least like the back and forth. I like the cat and mouse element of it, that I was interested to see where this could go from a character building standpoint. Where it ends up here, I think is a bit unfulfilling, because I feel like it's taking away that sense of agency that Grace seemed to evoke, and that pride she had in herself. It almost felt like backpedaling to me with that character.
Well, and this is where it gets a little interesting for me, because I think some of that backpedaling I actually found quite captivating, because after the bridge sequence where we noted Isla is killed, there is a turn in Grace. And I kind of love this turn because of Atwell and her performance and how she evokes the sense of wanting to belong. She does a great job of giving Grace this aura of loneliness. There's a really great moment in this film where we see her reaction to Ethan telling her that he considers her life more important, even though they don't know each other at all.
Right.
Why does that matter? He says. And her reaction shot, she almost comes undone in that moment.
Yeah.
And I think Atwell's performance is so great. So despite how messy the writing may be, Atwell does a great job of giving credence to the emotional truth of Grace. And I love that. So as we get to the train sequence and we see what transpires there and the sincerity of Grace in that moment, to me, that's what gives credence to what she says as far as accepting the mission. I actually thought it was kind of an empowering moment.
Yeah, I think those moments are good. I think it's less so about Haley Atwell, or not even Haley Atwell's performance, but the growth of Grace in her own way, as opposed to Ethan's view of her. And again, I don't think this is the movie's intent, but it almost comes off as Ethan just thinks of her as an object to protect. And
that's what the
came
writing
off
is
that way to me.
saying. Yeah, well,
that's why the writing is problematic to me.
Well, and I think that's where the cat and mouse game becomes problematic, because the film does not take any time to articulate those motives. It is simply this cat and mouse game. Like, why is Grace incessantly subverting Ethan, even though he is trying to protect her? He is saving her, especially when we very pragmatically, physically see she cannot maintain pace with the spy game. She doesn't have, she's not a trained spy. She's clever.
Right.
She's smart, but she can't drive the car. She can't fight the bad guys. Ethan has to do those things. And yet, despite that, she still subverts him every single time. Why? The film doesn't give us any explanation to that motive. And on the flip side of that coin, why does Ethan keep pursuing her, even though no matter what he does to protect her, no matter how affable it is, she always makes him vulnerable. Like, he almost gets killed by a train because she slaps that handcuff to the steering wheel, even though they would never have survived that without him driving that car. Why? Yeah. Why is Ethan pursuing her emotionally? Like, the film doesn't answer that. It's all about this cat and mouse game. So when these turns come, even though the performances are great, is it earned? To me, it's just all very thin until we get to part two. Part two might recontextualize all of this.
Because as we're talking about this, even despite all of the problems I have with the way that this relationship between Ethan and Grace crystallizes and how it seems to be viewed in a very odd way, I'm excited to see the character of Grace again. I really am.
Oh, me too. Absolutely.
I think I love Haley Atwell's presence. I think she's absolutely magnetic here.
She's great.
Yeah, and I would love to see what they do with her, to see if any of these problems resolve themselves in a proper way. I don't know if they will. In a vacuum, I think I'm always going to have problems with this movie. But that could be said about any part one that gets recontextualized with part two, right?
Yeah. Well, and I don't necessarily want to put that in concrete, though, because I felt this way about Rogue Nation initially. Like, the way you feel now is how I felt about Rogue Nation at the time. And then Fallout came, and it was a remedy to all of my questions. Right. And now I can go back and I can watch that film, and the problems I had with it have been alleviated. They, like the religious symbolism of this film, have transcended to the heavens. Okay? It's
the entity has awoken.
Exactly. So I could enjoy that movie, and it's very possible that part two comes along and does the same thing and alleviates my problems, because in a vacuum, I don't have an issue with the choices these characters make as it relates to that cat and mouse game. There's a lot of fun to be had there. I love the cleverness of Grace. Why she keeps subverting Ethan, I don't know. It kind of makes no sense to me, but dramatically, I think there's a lot of fun to be had there.
I feel like this movie, or not this movie, but I feel like with part two specifically, it feels like it's building to something really big from a narrative standpoint, not even just a spectacle and Mission Impossible standpoint. I feel like there are going to be a lot of surprise twists that come our way.
I think the film I think part two is going to connect those dots to this mysterious woman that we see in the flashbacks. And
it has to. Otherwise, it's
well, yes, maybe that's an obvious statement. But when we get to that in part two and we see Grace and how it invokes this person from Ethan's past, whatever that may be, I think at that point we'll look back at this and go, "Oh, I get it. I understand now why
I really
Ethan
hope
kept
so.
pursuing her, even though it made no sense for him to, because it just put him more in danger every single time." So yeah, I think we'll get there.
I think we're gonna get a
we'll there.
lot. I think we're gonna get a lot of masks ripped off in part 2 that are meant to surprise us in some way.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's just a hunch. Maybe it's a hope, but it's a hunch. I don't know.
Yeah,
But
we'll
yeah.
see. We'll certainly see.
We'll,
but
we'll see. I'm still very frustrated by this movie as we're seeing it now. It is my least favorite Mission Impossible film by quite a big margin. But maybe it'll get better as part 2 comes along to add some context to what this movie is doing.
Yeah,
because there are still some good things here. We haven't even mentioned what the heck's his name? Esai Morales, who plays Gabriel. I think he's a pretty good villain thus far as him being a rather compelling presence. I was always kind of hypnotized by him. He has a very calming nature that it is a bit it's very mannered, but it's also kind of hypnotic in a way. But it also doesn't overstate the entity. The entity is the real villain here. That's the primary antagonist here, and he doesn't overstate that, which I appreciate. But I do think he's fairly compelling. Not as compelling as Sean Harris in the other 2 films, though.
No, I don't think he's as compelling as Sean Harris or Philip Seymour Hoffman, which is my fave. But I do think that Gabriel is borderline, and again, I say this with the caveat that we're going to get more in part 2. At this point, though, it's a little one note,
Yeah.
and we don't really know much about him either, because again, those flashbacks have been extremely ambiguous, but we do know that he is a big part of those flashbacks, and they do address it a little bit. There's that scene there at the bar when Ethan and Gabriel meet for the first time, and Ethan thought that this character was dead for some reason or another. Yeah. But they haven't really addressed it. Even though there was a big fight at the end, the fight between them was just that. It was a fight. And at times, again, going back to the action, I thought it was thrilling enough, invoking that first Mission Impossible, but we don't really know much about Gabriel other than that he's the chosen one from the entity. That's all we know at this point. So I agree with you. I think Gabriel, the character, what he represents most here is that tone. That he is someone that knows what he's doing. He's a danger. He's powerful. And at this point, he can't really be stopped. Even though he doesn't walk away with the key at the end. But there's a tenacity to him that cannot be, I don't know, I can't think of the word. But
I was trying to let you figure it out, but okay, never mind.
No, my brain, after all of this discussion we've had this evening, is starting to not work as much.
We can't get the AI out of our heads.
Yeah,
we're too worried. We're too worried.
But he's someone you have to take seriously. And I do think that comes through in the performance very well, in the writing and just the tonal presence of the character. There's a formidable nature to him that I think is very good. So
it's interesting because apparently wasn't this the character that was originally meant to be played by Nicholas Hoult?
Oh, I don't know.
I know Nicholas Hoult was originally cast as the villain in this movie, and I think he was the Gabriel character.
Oh boy,
which is
I don't know.
Not at all what we got with Gabriel in this movie.
No, Morales is very good in that regard. As far as like portraying like that sense of dread in Gabriel, I think he's very good at that.
At the same time, I could see why you would want, or at least why maybe Christopher McQuarrie wanted someone like a Nicholas Hoult in that role at first, because to have someone kind of young and more tech savvy in that role, I could kind of see that. But it almost feels like the character had to be rewritten given the casting choice, if that was the case. Because I do remember Nicholas Hoult was originally tied to this movie, and I think the Gabriel character was who he was playing.
Yeah, that's interesting. As it is, though, I think Morales is very good given what he's asked to do. I imagine we'll learn more about him in part 2. I also want to shout out Ving Rhames. Luther is just the unsung hero of this entire franchise. He's wonderful here. That conversation he has with Ethan about Gabriel is one of my favorite scenes of the film because, again, going back to the tone of this film and the emotionality of it, the one thing that we haven't really talked about in this conversation either is that I do love what this film is aiming for in terms of its emotional core. It is trying to maintain a little bit of that Mission Impossible 3 Fallout thing where, you know, Ethan is very aware of the stakes and that the people around him are vulnerable because of who he is and how he is specifically involved here. His past relationship with Gabriel, the fact that Ethan is being hunted, and Luther pulls him aside, and very smartly, because earlier in the film Luther notes that they need to start thinking like the entity. They can't let emotion get in the way.
Right.
And he's done this a couple of times throughout the franchise where he speaks the truth.
He's the emotional center of the franchise in some ways.
He really does. And I love how he approaches Ethan. He's not afraid to let him know, like, hey, if you kill Gabriel, the entity
we
wins.
lose. We lose. Yeah.
You can't kill him. And that conversation, I think, is really powerful. And Ving Rhames, man, he's just so good in this role. He nails it. It's incredible. So, and I think that's interesting because Ethan, as much as he understands and respects Luther, and to a degree was going to listen to him, he actually did succumb to his emotion. And if not for
he just got lucky in the
moment. He got lucky that he was forced to stop killing him, but he was going to kill him. Yeah. And it's, you know, like little choices like that I think are great. And that's the McQuarrie, Tom Cruise, and in this case also Ving Rhames thing of like just being creative and thinking through like the complexities of human behavior.
Yeah. Which is why I still love that partnership that exists between McQuarrie and Tom Cruise. I love that they're still working together. And honestly, even despite me not liking this movie all that much, I do love that, once again, Christopher McQuarrie is making a film that doesn't feel anything like he's done before, at least within the Mission Impossible films, because Rogue Nation, Fallout, and now Dead Reckoning Part 1, they, again, almost all feel like they were made by different filmmakers. Yeah. And it's because in a lot of ways, you know, all three of them have different cinematographers, for one thing. Occasionally they change score, even though this does have Lauren Balfe coming back once again to do a very effective score as well. I think the music here is pretty effective too, but I do like that the aesthetics and the tones kind of change and morph as each film progresses, as if McQuarrie is still trying to maintain that that individualized ethos behind the camera with this franchise. And I like that. I like that it still feels a little different. And I'm still excited for Part 2 for those reasons, because I love this franchise. And maybe it'll come along and fix a lot of the issues that we have with this one.
Yeah, I do think Part 2 will remedy a lot of this, or at least I'm hoping for, because a lot of my reservations with this film, and I do feel like I've been more negative in this conversation than what I really am on it, because I did like the film on the whole. I just have some big questions that, depending on the answers to them, it will swing how much I really do like it. And it could end up being where I'm very mixed on this film if the answers aren't, I don't want to say satisfying, because I don't want to make it sound like the film has to pander to me. Yeah. But if we'll just say if the questions aren't answered, then I will end up being pretty mixed on this film. However, I am assuming and hoping that Part 2 will answer these questions as it relates to character and motive. Because again, the cat and mouse thing between Ethan and Grace, I love that dramatically. That's fun. But the character writing there is thin. The film just doesn't address what's motivating these characters in that regard. Why they keep making these same choices over and over and over and over again. Like, I don't know. Like, the film doesn't really address it yet. But we do think that the film is going to, especially because those flashback scenes are thrown in here.
They feel so random.
So like,
as if like they have to be a big part of Part 2. Like they just have to be.
I would imagine so. You know, I noted earlier, Gabriel is kind of one note here, but again, I assume he's going to be a big part of part 2 in terms of character progression because he's in the flashbacks as well. So we assume that he's going to end up doing more. So I think the film will address all of that in a way that will end up making me come back to part 1 and going, okay, now that I know what's going to happen, I can love this movie.
And McQuarrie has done that for you within this franchise, right?
And he's already done that
once.
once. So and so that gives me hope and optimism. And then my last thought here, and then we can kind of wind down, is, I mentioned Simon Pegg earlier. The humor of this film doesn't always work for me, but Simon Pegg, I think, is very good. I always love Benji. And he does such a great job of giving Benji this desperation, this urgency that I think is so genuine and sincere. Like that moment with the bomb in the airport.
I was just going to say, it might be my favorite scene in the movie.
The way that he kind of, he taps into a little bit of humor that's great, but also it's mostly about the sense of urgency that if I screw this up, everybody's dead. And it kind of all comes down to him. So like he's able to thread that needle so perfectly. Or I think about that moment at the end. And this again comes back to the whole idea of AI. And I don't think the film thinks through everything because like when he's in that car and we find out that it's a self-driving car, in my mind, I was like, oh, AI is going to take over this car and the entity will take over the car and Benji's either dead or there's going to be something at stake. Nope. Never a thing. Like,
well, he does. You could tell that there was an attempt to make that more layered, right? Because
because that's where the sense of humor is great because he does. It's like Benji thinks of it, so he buckles the seatbelt just in case.
But then he looks over at the steering wheel, like, was this the right call? But then
he's unsure. So
it's kind of twofold because
it's a little twofold. Yeah.
Well, it's also twofold because at the same time, it also feels like a product placement for BMW. So it's
it's a little bit.
You can't really have it both ways, movie. I mean, come on.
Yeah. And to me, it maybe undermines the power of the entity a little bit that, it can tap into their computers, no problem. It found their computers and it hacked into the earpiece. So it knows these guys. It knows that it's after them. But Benji and a car, a self-driving car, it can't tap into that. Like, again, I'm overthinking the logic, but that to me, again, I just feel like the AI is, like the film thinks it's smarter than what it actually is in that regard.
Yeah.
But I did like that moment of humor. At the very least, it was a nice comedic gag.
It's a good character moment because it's so in character for Benji, at least to react that way. But at the same time, he does. It's just, but it is more evidence that, again, maybe not a fair thing to say because it sounds like I'm asking for a movie that's more for me than it is itself. Or I should say, like, I don't want it to make it sound like I'm asking for it to do something that I want as opposed to what best serves the story it wants to tell. But I really would love to see in part 2 they embrace the analog technology more often. Like I would love the idea of it literally going back to the 90s. Like what if they're only using walkie-talkies in order to communicate? Like, and they have to stay within a certain mile range because they lose their range at a certain distance. Like new complications that they're not used to because of this entity. That is such a great idea that this movie does touch on. It introduces it. So I don't think it's unfair to say it doesn't do it well enough because it is bringing it up. It's a talking point here.
I agree. Yeah.
So I would love to see it become more literal in part 2 if that's the direction that they're going to go.
And maybe because of where this film ends and what's at stake, that analog will become more of a thing in the next film. And maybe visually you go back to using the same cameras they did for that first Mission Impossible. Yeah. Maybe you bring, like, I don't know, like, I don't want to say you invoke De Palma verbatimly. I don't want it to do that necessarily, but
right.
I don't know. I think it'd be fun to use the same cameras, maybe the same color palette a little bit, just make it a little bit 90s, maybe a little modern, but
imagine if it was announced Imagine if it was announced that McQuarrie was co-directing the film with Brian De Palma.
Well, I was going to say that, but I didn't want to make it. I guess I didn't want to make it sound like De Palma had to come back, and we have to go.
Oh no,
full
he
circle
doesn't have
in
to
a
come
direct
back.
way, but
yeah.
maybe you do. I mean, I wouldn't mind seeing De Palma come back in some way.
I would not either. Yeah, I would not either.
Just
I think
to bring
that'd
it
be
all
kind of
full
fun.
circle. Like maybe he
Yeah.
directs the analog part of it, and McQuarrie can do the modern
Yeah,
stunts and stuff like that. I don't
But
know.
at the very least, I would love to see part 2, maybe even symbolically, embrace that aesthetic, right, of that first Mission Impossible, because it does feel like we're getting there. And maybe this was just meant to set up the
This is a
need
tease, and then
this whole movie is a 3-hour tease that this team now needs to literally disconnect.
I love it. Yeah. And
If that is the case, I will come around on it just a little bit more if that ends up being what ends up happening.
And again, you think about what happened today, and those ideas are striking.
They are.
It is
Scary,
incredible.
but striking nonetheless.
At any rate, do you have any final thoughts on Dead Reckoning Part 1?
Nope, incomplete until part 2. So I guess we have a
that's
year
it.
or what, 11 months? I think it comes out in late June of next year, if I'm not mistaken.
I mean,
we'll see if that
assuming
still happens.
cinemas are still in existence.
Assuming movies are still a thing.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that'll do it for this review and this conversation. Let us know if you agree or disagree with any of our takes. I know a lot of people love this film, so it's very possible that you disagree with us. And look, I'm not saying that I disagree with you even. I just don't know. Like, it is incomplete is the best way to articulate. I just don't know at this point. So come at me or leave a comment. Let me know what you think, and I will respond in a year if I agree with you.
Or come
not.
or come more at me, because I was the one that admitted that I'm actually more negative on the film than I am positive.
You felt pretty negative.
I am very
about
mixed
it.
on it. Like I mean, I don't even like the idea of giving it a star rating on Letterboxd yet, because it does feel so incomplete. But the experience I had, this is probably a 2.5 out of 5 for me.
Wow. Okay.
Like that. That's how I'm feeling, at least at this point right now.
I think I could get that low if part 2 does not answer those lingering questions.
Gotcha.
If it's all left ambiguous, then I think I will come, because I have a lot of questions right now. But I am operating under the assumption that McQuarrie will tap into those in the next one.
Yeah.
So we'll see.
We'll see.
Anyway, let us know if you agree or disagree. Hit us up on social media: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, whatever the case may be. Rate and review us: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or on YouTube here. Leave a like, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and that'll do it. We will accept the next mission in 11 months. Until then, appreciate you all. We will see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Oh, man. I jumped off a cliff on that one.
You fell toward that. AI pushed up.